In this episode, we're going to take two terms that sound like privacy silver bullets and treat them the way a privacy engineer must treat them, as useful techniques with strict limits, and as claims that require verification rather than confidence. Beginners often hear anonymization and assume it means the data is safe forever, and they hear pseudonymization and assume it means the data is no longer personal. In reality, both techniques sit on a spectrum of identifiability, and the risk depends on what other data exists, what attackers can access, and how the data is used over time. The reason this topic matters so much is that organizations frequently use these techniques to unlock analytics, testing, and sharing while trying to reduce privacy risk, and the mistakes can be subtle but serious. If you overclaim anonymization, you may release or repurpose data that can still be linked back to real people. If you treat pseudonyms as anonymous, you may create tracking and profiling systems that keep working even when you believed you had removed identities. By the end, you should be able to explain the difference between anonymization and pseudonymization, recognize common failure modes, and describe how verification and governance make these techniques defensible rather than aspirational. A strong starting point is to define the terms clearly and to keep them separated in your mind. Anonymization is a process that aims to transform data so that individuals are no longer identifiable and not reasonably likely to become identifiable by any party using reasonably available means. That is a high bar because it is about the realistic possibility of re-identification, not just about removing names. Pseudonymization is a process that replaces direct identifiers with substitutes, like tokens or pseudonyms, so the dataset is harder to attribute to a person without additional information. The critical difference is that pseudonymized data is still designed to be linkable under controlled conditions, because the organization often wants to reconnect records for legitimate purposes like support or fraud investigations. Beginners should understand that anonymization tries to break the link permanently, while pseudonymization tries to protect the link by moving it behind a control boundary. Another important concept is that identifiability can be direct, like a name, or indirect, like a combination of attributes that uniquely points to a person. When you keep these definitions steady, you avoid the most common error, equating removal of obvious identifiers with true anonymity. Understanding quasi-identifiers is essential for honest limits, because quasi-identifiers are the ordinary-looking fields that become identifying when combined. Examples include age, postal code, job title, school, device type, and timestamps, which individually may seem harmless but together can create uniqueness. Beginners often assume that if you remove names and emails, the dataset becomes anonymous, but uniqueness can still reveal identity, especially when the dataset contains detailed behavioral information. Re-identification can occur when an attacker links the dataset to external sources, such as public records, social media posts, data broker lists, or other leaked datasets. The privacy reality is that linking is easier than many people think because many individuals have unique combinations of attributes and consistent patterns over time. This is why anonymization must be evaluated in context, including what other datasets exist and how motivated an attacker might be. It is also why the same dataset might be safer in one environment and risky in another, because re-identification risk depends on available auxiliary data and on who can access it. When you learn to see quasi-identifiers, you begin to understand why anonymous is a claim that must be proven, not assumed. Pseudonymization often uses tokenization, which is the act of replacing an identifier with a token, and the privacy benefit is that the dataset can be used for some purposes without exposing direct identity. The crucial limitation is that tokenization does not eliminate privacy risk if the token is stable and widely shared across systems, because a stable token can become a tracking handle. Beginners should notice that even if you do not know the person's name, you can still build a detailed profile of the token's behavior, which can lead to unfairness, discrimination, or intrusive personalization. The risk increases when tokens are used across multiple contexts, because cross-context tokens allow linking of behavior that users may expect to remain separate. Another limitation is that the mapping between token and identity must be protected strongly, because if the mapping table is compromised, tokenization can be reversed instantly. This is why pseudonymization is best understood as moving the sensitive link into a smaller, better protected system rather than removing it. A privacy-aware design treats token systems as high-risk assets with strict access control, auditing, and retention limits. When tokenization is used responsibly, it supports operational needs while reducing casual exposure of identities. Anonymization techniques are often described in terms of transforming data to reduce identifiability, and beginners should understand that this typically involves more than one step. Common approaches include removing direct identifiers, generalizing values into broader categories, suppressing rare values that create uniqueness, and adding noise or perturbation to reduce exactness. Another approach is aggregation, where data is summarized at group levels so individual records are not present in the output. Each technique reduces some risk, but can also reduce utility, which creates a tension that must be managed honestly. The privacy danger is that teams sometimes apply minimal transformation, keep most of the detail, and then call it anonymized because it looks less obvious. A truly privacy-aware approach acknowledges that utility and anonymity are often in tension and that the goal is to find a defensible balance for a specific use case. Beginners should also understand that anonymization is not a one-size-fits-all recipe, because what counts as identifying depends on the data and the environment. A dataset of rare medical conditions requires much stronger transformation than a dataset of broad website traffic counts, because uniqueness and harm potential are different. When you recognize that anonymization is tailored and context-dependent, you avoid the trap of thinking there is a universal checklist. Honest limits include acknowledging that anonymization can fail over time as new datasets become available and as analytics techniques improve. A dataset that seemed difficult to re-identify today may become easier to re-identify in the future as additional data sources appear or as linking methods become more powerful. Beginners should see this as a life cycle issue, because privacy risk is not static, and storing or sharing anonymized datasets indefinitely can create future exposure. Another limit is that anonymization does not protect against group harms, where analysis of anonymous data can still reveal sensitive patterns about communities, neighborhoods, or small groups, even if individuals are not named. This matters because privacy engineering is not only about individual identification, but also about preventing unfair or harmful inferences at scale. Another limit is that anonymization can be undermined by system design decisions, such as including stable identifiers, detailed timestamps, or fine-grained location data that enable linkage. This is why minimization must still apply even when anonymization is planned, because the more detail you collect and store, the harder anonymization becomes. When you treat anonymization as reducing risk rather than eliminating risk, you naturally design with caution and avoid overpromising. Verification is the part that turns anonymization and pseudonymization from hopeful transformations into defensible controls. Verification starts by defining the threat model, meaning who might try to re-identify data, what auxiliary data they might have, and what resources they might use. If the data will be shared externally, the threat model should be stronger than if it will remain in a tightly controlled internal environment, because external recipients and attackers can vary widely. Verification then involves assessing re-identification risk, which can include checking uniqueness of records, evaluating how many individuals share the same combinations of attributes, and testing whether linkage to known external datasets could succeed. Beginners do not need to run statistical models to grasp the principle that you must measure risk rather than assume it. Another verification practice is red team-style testing, where a team attempts to re-identify a sample using realistic auxiliary information, documenting what succeeded and what failed. For pseudonymization, verification includes testing whether the mapping between pseudonyms and identities is protected, whether access is logged, and whether tokens appear in logs or exports in ways that increase linkability. When verification is routine and documented, organizations can justify their privacy claims and adjust transformations when risk is higher than expected. Governance is essential because anonymized and pseudonymized data still needs rules about access, use, retention, and disclosure. A common beginner misconception is that once data is anonymized, it can be used for anything. But that can be risky because anonymity may not be absolute, and because derived insights can still harm people and groups. A privacy-aware governance model defines permitted uses, such as research or product improvement, and prohibits uses that would create harm, such as attempts to re-identify individuals or to target vulnerable groups. Governance also includes access controls, because even anonymized datasets can contain sensitive patterns and can be combined with other datasets by insiders. For pseudonymized data, governance must define who can reverse the pseudonym and under what conditions, because that power is equivalent to identity access. Retention rules should also be applied, because keeping transformed data indefinitely increases future risk, especially if re-identification becomes easier over time. Beginners should understand that governance is how you prevent transformed datasets from being quietly repurposed beyond their original justification. When governance is explicit, the organization can enjoy legitimate uses of data while limiting the chance of misuse and overreach. Another area where honest limits matter is machine learning, because models can learn patterns that enable inference even when training data is pseudonymized or partially anonymized. If a model is trained on detailed behavior, it may produce outputs that reveal sensitive traits or that allow individuals to be singled out, especially when the model is used in individualized decision-making. Beginners should understand that removing names does not prevent a model from learning that a particular pattern corresponds to a particular person if the training data is linkable or if the model is queried in ways that reveal memorized details. This is why privacy engineers consider not only the dataset, but also what outputs and interfaces the model provides, because outputs can leak information. Anonymization of training data does not automatically anonymize model behavior, and pseudonymization does not prevent inference if the model can connect patterns to stable identifiers. This is also why verification should include evaluating outputs, not just inputs, and why governance should include limits on model use cases and access. When you treat models as data products that can leak information, you avoid relying on transformations alone. The result is a more realistic privacy posture that matches modern analytics reality. A practical way to apply these techniques without overpromising is to treat pseudonymization as a controlled design pattern and anonymization as a carefully verified claim. Pseudonymization is often best used for internal processing where you need linkage under strict conditions, such as separating identity from behavior, so most teams can work with reduced sensitivity. That pattern works well when the mapping system is tightly controlled and when tokens are not shared broadly across contexts. Anonymization is often best used for sharing and broad analytics where you want to remove individual-level risk, but it requires stronger transformation and careful verification, especially when datasets contain rich detail. Beginners should also understand that some datasets may not be suitable for anonymization at all because they are too unique, too small, or too sensitive. And in those cases, the safer approach may be to use aggregated reporting or privacy-preserving analysis methods rather than releasing individual-level records. Another practical insight is that transparency matters internally, because teams should not label a dataset anonymized unless it truly meets the defined risk threshold, since labels influence behavior and may encourage risky reuse. When terms are used precisely, governance is easier and trust is stronger. Precision in language becomes precision in control. A common failure mode is confusing pseudonymization with encryption because both can make data look unreadable at a glance. Encryption hides content from unauthorized readers until it is decrypted, while pseudonymization replaces identifiers but leaves much of the content readable. That means a pseudonymized dataset can still reveal sensitive behavior patterns, and if tokens are stable, it can support long-term profiling. Another failure mode is using hashing of identifiers as a form of pseudonymization without understanding that hashes of predictable values can be reversed by guessing and matching. Beginners should remember that hashing creates a stable transformation, so it can enable linking across datasets, and if the original values are guessable, it can enable re-identification. Another failure mode is treating anonymization as a one-time event, then continuing to add new fields and new datasets that increase uniqueness and linkage risk without re-verifying. This is why verification should be repeated when datasets change, when new auxiliary data sources become available, or when the dataset's audience expands. The last failure mode is failing to control outputs, like reports that reveal small group statistics, because output disclosures can re-identify individuals even if the underlying dataset was transformed. When you know these failure patterns, You can spot exam scenarios where a team believes they reduced risk but actually created a different kind of risk. As we conclude, the essential lesson is that anonymization and pseudonymization are useful privacy tools only when they are applied with honest limits and backed by verification and governance. Anonymization aims to make individuals not reasonably identifiable, which is a high bar that depends on context, auxiliary data, and uniqueness, and it must be tested rather than assumed. Pseudonymization reduces exposure by separating identity from other data and placing the link behind strict controls, but it does not eliminate privacy risk and can enable tracking if tokens are stable and widely shared. Quasi-identifiers and linkability are the main reasons naive approaches fail, because identity can be reconstructed from combinations of ordinary fields or from external data sources. Verification requires clear threat modeling, measurement of re-identification risk, and practical testing, while governance ensures transformed data is used only for justified purposes, accessed only by appropriate roles, and retained only as long as needed. In modern analytics and machine learning, inputs and outputs both matter because inference and memorization can leak information even when direct identifiers are removed. When you can explain these techniques without overpromising and can describe how to validate and govern them, you are demonstrating the privacy engineering mindset this domain expects, protecting people by matching the claim you make about data to the reality of what can still be learned from it.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.